outlined by this proverb is that the master narrative of our society is a master narrative that tells us that racism is a thing of the past, that we live in a post-racial era, that in some sense, if you work hard enough, you will succeed in this society, what I call the myth of meritocracy. And in race talk and dialogues, there is a master narrative going on that tends to have the force and power to define reality. And this is one thing I do want to say that is very important. The racial realities of white Americans as a group is different from the racial realities of people of color. And it is a clash of racial realities that is at play when we talk about difficult dialogues that are going on in terms of race. The unfortunate thing, however, is the master narrative has the power to overcome, to submerge the counter narrative that people of color talk about.
Racism is a system, not an event. Right? And it's the system we're in. And none of us could be, and none of us were exempt from its forces. Right? But the way we're taught to think of racism functions beautifully to not only obscure the system, but to exempt us from its forces, right? Or to have us believe we are exempted from its forces. Now, as a white person, I was raised to be racially illiterate. And I actually think all white people are raised to be racially illiterate in this culture. And in gaining racial literacy, I have had to understand not just the collective dynamics and dimensions of racism, but how racism impacts different groups who are perceived and defined as people of color, how it impacts them differently. Right? So not all peoples of color experience racism differently. The things I've internalized about different groups is different. Where and how they are positioned always in relation to whiteness or far away from whiteness, and how that manifests, right? All of that must be understood. But after a good 20 plus years of talking day in and day out to white people about racism, I feel very confident to say that there is something profoundly anti-black in this culture.
Hello, brothers and sisters. Welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you are doing great from wherever you're watching this video from. As you know, I'm your host and again, presenter Eugene Stories. Brothers and sisters, let me be serious. Brothers and sisters, there's two different realities in the United States. There's a reality that belongs to a black person, and there's a reality that belongs to a white person. These two people are like here and here. And so, their reality. Now, this is what I'm going to talk about. So many times, they have said that America is a land of opportunity, that you just need to work hard and you'll get everything figured out. Because the United States rewards merit, and merit includes putting in the work, working extra hours, proving yourself, moving up and down, trying to deal with deadlines. That's how the United States grade you as a person who is doing great in the United States. But what if I told you that the reality is not the same? That we have black people that are putting in even much work. I don't know if that's correct to use, but we have black people that are putting in extra work just to be recognized. But we have a mediocre white person who sits on a chair during the day and gets everything figured out at the end of the month. But this is not the same for black people. And I think for the longest time, black people have always been trying to prove themselves that they can do anything. And you can even check this out. When you see a black person holding a position, know that they worked 3 or 4 times harder than a white person to secure the same spot. And this lands us to one conclusion, or this lands us to one thing. And the one thing is that the reality of black people is not the same with the reality of white people. Because for black people, they'll use these words. Pull yourself by the bootstraps. Oh, maybe you just need to put in a little bit work. Oh, maybe if you stop being lazy, you can get the job done. Look at that white people Look at that white person. He just graduated from the college. Right now he's working in the bank. For you black person, it is not the same. And I'll call this has been happening historically. When you understand the history of redlining, and this is something that has been and has made black people not become successful in the entire United States. And we are looking at a systemic issue. And then we are looking at a lie that was sold to black people. And this is meritocracy. One of the biggest lies that was sold to black Americans, meritocracy. That if you work hard, you are able to achieve anything. But this theory doesn't look into things that are happening down below the sea level. The structural issues. And all these things that are going on right now that we are seeing, that we are observing. I don't know if that makes sense to you. But hey, brothers and sisters, I want us to watch this video, and then I'm going to be back. I'll be giving my 2 cents in regards to this. So let's watch the video.
Racism is a system, not an event. Right? And it's the system we're in. And none of us could be, and none of us were exempt from its forces. Right? But the way we're taught to think of racism functions beautifully to not only obscure the system, but to exempt us from its forces, right? Or to have us believe we are exempted from its forces. Now, as a white person, I was raised to be racially illiterate, and I actually think all white people are raised to be racially illiterate in this culture. And in gaining racial literacy, I have had to understand not just the collective dynamics and dimensions of racism, but how racism impacts different groups who are perceived and defined as people of color, how it impacts them differently. Right? So not all peoples of color experience racism differently. The things I've internalized about different groups is different. Where and how they are positioned always in relation to whiteness or far away from whiteness, and how that manifests, right? All of that must be understood. But after a good 20 plus years of talking day in and day out to white people about racism, I feel very confident to say that there is something profoundly anti-black in this culture. And that nothing seems to turn white people's cranks of resentment, like thinking black people got something over on us that they didn't deserve. And the deeper belief is that they're inherently undeserving. I believe in the white mind, black people are the ultimate racial other, right? And that there are these bookends. And again, your perceived proximity to each end of that impacts how you're going to experience your racialization. So having said that, and not really having time to do history, I just want to give you one glance at the trajectory of anti-blackness in this country since its beginning, and this slide will be deliberately dense. We can literally think about it as state-sanctioned, organized crime, but at least discrimination against African Americans from the beginning. And it starts with kidnapping and 300 years of enslavement, torture, rape, and brutality, and it carries on. And about a quarter of the way in, you see bans on testifying against whites, which made it technically legal to murder black people in this country, and you are now in my lifetime. And I'm going to say it again because, again, a lot of white people seem to think it ended a long time ago. We're in my lifetime about a quarter of the way through that slide. And then we see about 2/3 of the way through employment discrimination, and we are in 2018 with copious empirical evidence. Right? So let's pick it up there. Employment discrimination, educational discrimination, biased laws and policing practices, white flight, subprime mortgages, mass incarceration, the school-to-prison pipeline, disproportionate special ed referrals and punishments, testing, tracking, school funding, biased media representation, historical omissions, and so much more. It is a system, not an event. It's the system we're in, and none of us could be, and none of us were exempt from its forces. If we want to be unique and special individuals, then we need to figure out how whatever we see is special and different about us set us up into that system, because it did. So I'm talking, I know white people really well. I'm talking X, and you're like, ha, I was Y, right? Okay, you were Y, most whites are X. How did Y set you up? It did. Right? The question is not if, it's how. Okay? I'm going to repeat it. It's a system, not an event. And how do we cope with the moral trauma of what I just read to you? Resmaa Menakem has a beautiful book, My Grandmother's Hands, where he talks about racial trauma. There's a trauma, I believe, to white people of racism, but I don't think it's a moral trauma, right? And it's a piece of white fragility, not being able to face our complicity in this system. Well, historically, we projected our sins onto the black body, right? Lazy, shiftless, criminal. We projected our sins onto the black body. Right? Today, in addition to doing that, we obscure the system of racism that we uphold and we exempt ourselves from its forces. Right? And we do this in a way that appears to be progressive, right? That race doesn't matter to us. This is the board after the grand champion College Jeopardy round, right? And for me, it just speaks volumes, right? Not again, knowing our history and being able to trace it into the present is one of the volumes it speaks. Another one is, that is the history of this country. It is not their history. It didn't happen in a vacuum. So one of the aspects of institutional power is the ability to disseminate your worldview to everyone, to position it as objective and universal, right? And to tell the story, right? The story of the other when we are not in relationship with the other. Right? So I want to give you an example of the power of the story. And I want to do it through the Jackie Robinson story. You all know Jackie Robinson? Right? So Jackie Robinson has been quite celebrated for doing something. What's the tagline that goes with Jackie Robinson? He broke the color line, right? Now, so let's do a little discourse analysis. Because every year on the anniversary, we celebrate him breaking the color line. So think about what that invokes, right? He was exceptional. He was special. He did it. Finally, one of them had what it took to break through and play with us. Up until him, nobody had what it took. So subtext, inferior group, right? But he did it, and of course, the day he did it, the day he broke the color line, racism in sports ended. So imagine if we told a story like this. Jackie Robinson, the first black man that whites allowed to play Major League Baseball. And I want you to notice the difference in that story. One, that's the truth. It didn't matter how exceptional he was, and I actually don't believe he was the first most exceptional. But if we didn't say he could play, he couldn't play. If he walked out onto that field before we said you can walk out on the field, the police would have removed him. It wasn't up to him, right? Now, the reason I want us to tell the story the second way is, one, because it's true, and two, because I need role models, right? How did white people get organized? What did they do behind the scene? What barriers did they face? What challenges, right? What strategies did they use? And could we use any of those today and adapt any of those today? Right? It's not about me wanting to point out how bad white people are. Right? So chapter 3 looks at racism after the civil rights movement. And after the civil rights movement, it made a brilliant adaptation. So post-civil rights, racism got reduced to the following formula. A racist is an individual who consciously does not like people based on race and is intentionally mean to them. Always an individual, must be conscious, must be intentional. And that definition exempts virtually all white people from the system of racism. This definition, I believe, is the root of virtually all white defensiveness on racism. Have you guys noticed any white defensiveness on racism? Yeah. It makes it virtually impossible to talk to the average white person about the inevitable absorption of a racist worldview that we get from being socialized in a racist culture in which white supremacy is the bedrock. Because you suggest that anything I have done is racially problematic in any way, and I'm going to hear a question to my moral character. And I'm going to need to defend my moral character. Right? And we've probably seen this a million times. Right? So that definition actually functions to protect racism, even as it looks like progress, right? Racism became bad post-civil rights. So this sets up what I think about as the good-bad binary. That kind of, it's either or, right? Racists are bad, not racists are good. And we know how to fill that in, don't we? Ignorant, bigoted, prejudiced, mean-spirited, definitely old. And when we die off, there'll be no more racism. You know, I've been working with a lot of these tech companies that when I walk around, I think to myself, God, I guess you have to be under 30 to work here. And I'm telling you, they cannot think critically about race. And the people of color that work with these young people are in so much pain, right? No, I get asked all the time, do you think young people today are less racist? Oh, actually, the question usually begins with, don't you think? And just a heads up, if you approach me with, don't you think, the answer is no. Because that's not an open question. But no, I don't actually think young people today are less racist, because that consciousness hasn't changed our outcomes. In fact, they're getting worse, right? Okay, so Southern for sure, don't you think? Around here, I'm pretty sure they live in Fife. I've never been to Fife, but on the way to Tacoma, I see Fife. I'm like, ooh, boy, it looks like racists live there. And when I'm on my way up north, it's like Smoky Point. Okay? All right. Not racists are good. We're educated, progressive, open-minded, well-intended. We're young. We're northern. We live on Finney Ridge. But we're all moving to Portland really soon. Because Whole Foods is so corporate now. Again, this is the root of virtually all white defensiveness, and it just functions so beautifully to exempt us. So we just have to get rid of it. And when white people hear me and they feel angry and pissed off and defensive, can I just say this now that you guys are loosening me up here? When you laugh at my jokes, I'm going to keep getting looser and looser. Damn white people are pissy about racism. We are so pissy on this topic. We're mean on this topic, right? And so if you're sitting here feeling that, just see if it isn't rooted in this definition. And if you cannot let go of this, you're just not going to be able to move forward. So aversive racism is a form of what sociologists call new racism, right? And so it's racism that progressive whites are most likely to hold, but because it conflicts with our identities as good people, we're most likely to be in denial about it. So let me find that piece. It's a manifestation of racism that well-intentioned people who see themselves as educated and progressive are more likely to exhibit. It exists under the surface of consciousness because it conflicts with consciously held beliefs of racial equity and justice. Aversive racism is a subtle but insidious form, as aversive racists enact racism in ways that allow them to maintain a positive self-image, e.g., I have lots of friends of color, I judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And whites enact racism while maintaining a positive self-image in many ways. For example, rationalizing racial segregation as unfortunate but necessary to access good schools. Rationalizing that our workplaces are virtually all white because people of color just don't apply. Avoiding direct racial language and using racially coded terms such as urban, underprivileged, diverse, sketchy, and good neighborhoods. Denying that we have few cross-racial relationships by proclaiming how diverse our community or workplace is. And attributing inequality between whites and people of color to causes other than racism. Consider a conversation I had with a white friend. She was telling me about a white couple who she knew who had just moved to New Orleans and bought a house for a mere $25,000. Of course, she immediately added, they also had to buy a gun, and Joan is afraid to leave the house. I immediately knew they had bought a home in a black neighborhood. This was a moment of white racial bonding between this couple who shared the story of racial danger and my friend, and then between my friend and me as she repeated the story. Through this tale, the four of us fortified familiar images of the horror of black space and drew boundaries between us and them without ever having to directly name race or openly express our disdain for black space. Notice that the need for a gun is a key part of this story. It would not have the degree of social capital it holds if the emphasis were on the price of the house alone. Rather, the story's emotional power rests on why a house would be that cheap. Because it's in a black neighborhood where white people literally might not get out alive. Yet while very negative and stereotypical representations of blacks were reinforced in that exchange, not naming race provided plausible deniability. In fact, in preparing to share this incident, I texted my friend and asked her the name of the city her friends had moved to. I also wanted to confirm my assumption that she was talking about a black neighborhood. I share the text exchange here. Hey, what city did you say your friends had bought a house in for $25,000? She replies, New Orleans. They said they live in a very bad neighborhood and they each have to have a gun to protect themselves. I wouldn't pay 5 cents for that neighborhood. I reply, oops. I assume it's a black neighborhood? Yes, you get what you pay for. I'd rather pay $500,000 and live somewhere where I wasn't afraid. I reply, I wasn't asking because I want to live there. I'm writing about this in my book. The way that white people talk about race without ever coming out and talking about race. She had a very interesting response to that. I wouldn't want you to live there because it's too far away from me. Notice that when I simply ask what city the house is in, she repeats the story about the neighborhood being so bad that her friends need guns. When I ask if the neighborhood is black, she's comfortable confirming that it is. But when I tell her that I'm interested in how whites talk about race without talking about race, she switches the narrative. Now her concern is about not wanting me to live so far away. This is a classic example of aversive racism, holding deep racial disdain that surfaces in daily discourse, but not being able to admit it because the disdain conflicts with our self-image and professed beliefs. Now, readers may be asking themselves, but if the neighborhood is really dangerous, why is acknowledging this danger a sign of racism? Research in implicit bias has shown that perceptions of criminal activity are influenced by race. White people will perceive dangers simply by the presence of black people. We cannot trust our perceptions when it comes to race and crime. But regardless of whether the neighborhood is actually more or less dangerous than other neighborhoods, what is salient about this exchange is how it functions racially and what that means for the white people engaged in it. For my friend and me, this conversation did not increase our awareness of the danger of some specific neighborhood. Rather, the exchange reinforced our fundamental beliefs about black people. Toni Morrison uses the term race talk to capture, quote, the explicit insertion into everyday life of racial signs and symbols that have no meaning other than positioning African Americans into the lowest level of the racial hierarchy, unquote. Casual race talk is a key component of white racial framing because it accomplishes the interconnected goals of elevating whites while demeaning people of color. Race talk always implies a racial us and them. So folks who have seen seen me present before know that I use this metaphor, and I do tend to think in metaphors. And as I do the work that I do and I talk on a daily basis to white people, I literally got this image in my mind of a dock or a pier. And what it signifies for me are two things. One, how surface or superficial our narratives are. But also the dock, if you look from above, appears to be floating on the water. But it's not. There's an entire structure submerged under the water that props that dock up. It rests on literally pillars anchored into the ocean floor. And everything I do in my work is trying to get us off the top of the dock and under there to examine those pillars. Because despite all the bullshit on top of the dock, our outcomes have not changed. Right? So we have to ask ourselves, what's going on? Right? So as I listen to these narratives, I think about them in two overall categories: colorblind and color celebrate. Right? So let's start with the first set, colorblind. Probably the number one colorblind racial narrative is, I was taught to treat everyone the same. Anybody ever heard that one? Okay. Let me just tell you, when I hear this from a white person, and I hear it frequently, there's a bubble over my head. And it has a few things in it. The first thing is, oh, this person doesn't understand basic socialization. This person doesn't understand culture. Ooh, this person is not particularly self-aware. Right? And I need to give a heads up to the white folks in the room. When people of color hear us say this, they're generally not thinking, all right, I am talking to a woke white person right now. Usually some form of eye rolling. And actually I recently co-facilitated with a black woman who said, that is the most dangerous white person to me. Okay? So it's not functioning the way we think it is, and this is another piece of humility for us. We are the least qualified to determine whether we understand this or not, right? Because so often the things that we think convey that are not conveying that. And all of these are within that, it's in the past, just everyone struggles. My parents weren't racist, that's why I'm not racist. Oh, my parents were racist, that's why I'm not racist. Doesn't matter really what we say first, what comes next must be, I'm not racist. So-and-so just happened to be, but it has nothing to do with race. And it also has nothing to do with why no one in the office gets along with her. And this is another one I actually asked white folks to remove from their vocabulary. Oh, by the way, along with reverse racism, which there's no such thing. Right? All right. Remove from your vocabulary anything on the topic of race that begins with just happened to be regardless, including that your neighborhood just happened to be white. Right? Yes, but at the human level, when we make that move, right? Get race off the table and let's position some kind of shared universal experience. There isn't one in this physical plane that we live in a society deeply separate and unequal by race. Right? So I call these colorblind because they basically say, I don't see it, and if I see it, it has no meaning. And there's a question that has never failed me in my efforts to uncover how we pull this off. Right? And that question is not, is this true or is this false? Because if we apply that question, we're going to argue and argue and argue. The question that has never failed me is, how do these narratives function in the conversation? How does it function? And if we ask that question, we can see that all of these narratives function to exempt the person from any part of the problem. All of them take race off the table. All of them close rather than open the exploration. And in doing that, all of them protect the current racial hierarchy and the white position within it. It doesn't have to be your intention. And I'll just be blunt. I'm not interested in your intention. I'm interested in how this functions. What is the impact of these narratives? They are closers, not openers. Well, probably the folks in this room, we're beyond colorblindness, right? What do we say? Right? Where's my little clicker? Here it is. Okay. We say things like this. Oh, I work in a very diverse environment. If we can't say that, and many of us can't, we'll come up with some kind of proximity. Okay? I have people of color in my family. Me? Pff, I'm not racist. I used to live in New York. This one will get used interchangeably with, I'm not racist, I'm from Canada. I'm not racist, I'm from Hawaii. I'm not racist, I'm from Europe. I'm not racist, I was in the military. Apparently there are no racism in any of those places. When I hear that one, I used to live in New York, I was thinking, oh my God, you walked by people of color and didn't lose your shit? That's amazing. Okay. So how many of you in a conversation with a white person have heard some version of those narratives right there, those three? Okay. All right. And if we're going to be really honest, we've said some version of these narratives, right? That last one, sociologists actually have a term for it. It's called the inoculation case. I've been near people of color and it stripped me of my racism. And I want you to notice how often white people invoke proximity as evidence. This is important because it helps reveal what's under the dock. It helps reveal what we think racism is, that we would invoke proximity to show that we're not racist. And I need to understand what I think racism is if I'm going to unpack my role in it, right? So let's do some discourse analysis. Let's think critically about these three narratives. When a white person invokes one of these narratives in a conversation about racism, they're giving you their evidence, right? Racism comes up, I say this is my evidence. In my mind, what's that my evidence of? What do I want to make sure you know? I'm not racist. All right? So, in order to be good at evidence, it must distinguish me from a racist. So apparently, a racist cannot do these things, or this wouldn't be good evidence. So a racist cannot work 3 cubicles down from a person of color. Could not have people come in their family, and would find living in New York intolerable, even though I could think of at least one racist that lives in New York. So, now I've yet to let go of that little joke because I do enjoy it, but it does rest on the good-bad binary. I'm on the same continuum the person I'm thinking of is on. Just want to be clear about that. Okay, so I'm going to just ask a rhetorical question to the people of color in this room, and I'm going to look at my dear friend Aisha over there and Paula, and I'm going to say, could a racist work 3 cubicles down from you? Hell yes. All right. People of color, do you have white people in your life who you love deeply and who on occasion reveal their internalized racial superiority? Their internalized racist assumptions about the world? Other white people, do you hear that? Could you even be married to them? And they could still? It doesn't disappear the day they fall in love with you? Okay. All right. So I hope I mock it a bit because it's ridiculous, right? But it's so ubiquitous. So we really just got to ask ourselves, well, what do I think it is, and what am I saying, and how is that functioning, right? And clearly this rests on that, on that simplistic definition. Apparently a lot of white people think that a racist cannot tolerate any proximity, even the sight of people of color. And so if there's any friendliness across race, there cannot be racism. This is another thing that makes us so difficult in these conversations. So I'm just going to put it right out here. As a result of being born and raised as a white person in this culture, I have a racist worldview. I have deep racist biases. I have developed racist patterns. And I have investments in a system that has served me very well and is very comfortable for me, and it really helped me get over sexism and classism that I struggle with. And I also have investments in not seeing any of that, for what it would mean for my identity and what it would require of me in action. Right? I can choose it, don't want it, got it. And it's actually incredibly transformative and liberating to begin from that premise. So that you can begin to think, well, how's it coming out in me? so that I might be able to stop that or ameliorate that rather than it's not coming out in me. I sometimes think if I went into the bathroom and I came out and the back of my dress was hiked into my pantyhose and my ass was showing, I sure hope you'd let me know. And I wouldn't say to you, how dare you suggest my ass is showing? And you better proceed as if it isn't. And yet, you know, the worst fear of a white progressive is that we're going to say or do something racist. But by God, don't you dare say that I just said or did something racist. Rather than, thank you. You know, I didn't see myself doing that, and now I can do something different. All right, I was in the Peace Corps. I marched in the 60s. I voted for Obama. I'm on the equity team. I could go on. I already know all this. I told you I've been to Costa Rica and tutored there for a week with the little children. And this is a real Seattle one. We don't like how white our neighborhood is, but we had to move here for the schools. What could we do? I think it's very disingenuous. I think we do like how white our neighborhoods are. And that's another conversation. All right, so these are not colorblind. These are color celebrate. I love it, right? And I'm going to just say this. I love it in the right doses. I like it in the Montessori school with the children of the international workers that come from Microsoft. So again, if we apply the same question, not true, false, or right, wrong, but how do these narratives function in the conversation, we get the same answer. They all exempt the person from any part of the problem. They all take race off the table. They all close rather than open. And they all protect the current racial hierarchy and the white position within it. They're actually, in practice and impact, not any more progressive. And they have not changed our outcomes. So we have to get under here and see what's going on. And what I think is going on, what I think of as the linchpins of new racism, right, is the good-bad binary, and that one's really effective. Deep implicit bias, which you can't help but absorb. This precious ideology of individualism. At the same time, this idea that we don't speak from any particular position, but speak for all of humanity. And people of color speak for their group, and when we're interested in hearing about that, we'll ask them, but we'll cover everything else, right? Any people of color get asked to be on the equity team automatically when it's not even necessarily your interest or, okay. Internalized superiority, which you cannot help but have if you are raised white in this culture. And in some level an investment in not seeing this. And finally, the power of segregation to hold it all in place. The profound, I think for me the most profound message of all is that I could call a white neighborhood good. I could call a school filled with all white teachers and white children a good school. That the fundamental message is that there's no inherent value in the perspectives or experiences of people of color. So these messages are raining down on us relentlessly, 24/7, and we don't have umbrellas. And nothing could and nothing did exempt us from their forces. It's on us to figure out how they shape us, not if. Right? So all of this sets up some patterns, right? Preference for racial segregation, lack of understanding what racism is, seeing ourselves as individuals, not understanding that we bring our history with us. History matters. It's a history of harm. Assuming everyone is having our experience, arrogance, lack of humility, unwillingness to listen, right? Dismissing what we don't understand, apathy towards racial justice. You know, after, again, 20 plus years, I think most white people are pretty apathetic about racial injustice. Inability to or lack of interest in sustaining relationships with people of color, wanting to jump over the hard personal work and get to solutions.
In some sense, if you work hard enough, you will succeed in this society, what I call the myth of meritocracy. And in race talk and dialogues, there is a master narrative going on that tends to have the force and power to define reality. And this is one thing I do want to say that is very important. The racial realities of white Americans as a group is different from the racial realities of people of color. And it is a clash of racial realities that is at play when we talk about difficult dialogues that are going on in terms of race. The unfortunate thing, however, is the master narrative has the power to overcome, to submerge the counter narrative that people of color talk about. One of my colleagues, Dr. Luann Bell at Barnard College, writes about this very, very descriptively and insightfully. She says that when you look at race talk, the master narrative is composed of white talk. When you hear the talk of people of color, it represents back talk, a counter narrative that takes issue with the meaning that is embedded in the messages that is going on. And this is what you see going on in class when people engage in racial dialogues. And I think we have clear evidence of the importance of racial dialogues in lessons that we can learn from the killing of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman, the killing of Michael Brown and Eric Gardner. That what we have here, when people talk about potential bias, prejudice going on, most well-intentioned white Americans don't see it that way because they believe that racism and race had nothing to do with it. That is their reality that they are attempting to impose on others. Now, we frequently ask this particular question: how is it that the grand jury that came to the conclusion that Michael Brown and Eric Gardner was not guilty and no charges were brought? How was it that George Zimmerman was declared not guilty in a jury trial that was going on? And what we have to understand is that attorneys know this very well, right, Janice? That if you create a reality that jurors will accept, the decision, the definition of the problem, the outcome will support the means here. So that what we have here is that when you go before a grand jury or a jury in terms of race issues, for them to say race had nothing to do with it is a fallacy. Race had everything to do with it. They are in essence saying is that race from the perspective of people of color had nothing to do with it, but white culture, white race has everything and it's important. When you eliminate the discussion of racial differences, you fall back on the default standard of white Western European rules and regulations that underlie jury decisions, how the process is conducted in those particular selections. And these are things we have evidence of this going on constantly in terms of one of the things that I do want to do is that I've decided to dedicate all of my presentations that I make this year to Maya Angelou. And many of you know that she passed away in May of 2014. And one of the things that I want to say is that it is so significant to me because I finished my book, Race Talk, at a period the same day that it was announced that Maya Angelou had passed. And it seemed significant to me, almost symbolic, that she was saying to all of us to carry on her legacy, to tell the stories that are most silenced and unheard, that people find most uncomfortable in terms of truly understanding. And I think that one of the things that strikes me about this is that Maya Angelou told a different story, what I call the rest of the story. In her novels, in her poetry, in her presentations. And there is two passages that I am especially struck by that I want to share with you, in which she tells a story that others find very disturbing. Not only in terms of her novel, Now I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, but Still I Rise, a poem that really many of us read over and over to distill the meaning. In this one, she writes this particular passage: "You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may tread me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. You may shoot me with your words. You may cut me with your eyes. You may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I'll rise." There are many aspects of this that have meaning to us, people of color that understand. She talks about the resilience that people of color endure and overcome in order to survive many of these onslaughts. She was among the first to begin to talk about what I have called racial microaggressions. She didn't label it that way, but these are racial microaggressions that are environmental, that are verbal, that are nonverbal. When she says, "You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies," she's talking about curriculum issues, that the educational content portrays racial, ethnic, or people of color in stereotypic or maladaptive, distorted ways that people imbibe and take into. You may tread me in the very dirt, but still like dust I'll rise. You may shoot me with your words. You may say things to us. Or you may cut me with your eyes. Nonverbal behaviors. This is one of the things that she's talking about. That the everyday invalidations, insults, put-downs that people of color experience are communicated to us non-verbally or by words. The problem that she talks about in microaggressions, which forms a heart of, for example, our studies indicate that almost all difficult dialogues on race are triggered by a racial microaggression. The problem is the perpetrator, the person delivering it, whether it be a fellow student or even a professor, that person is unaware that they are delivering a put-down message to the individual. And the other thing that Maya Angelou talks about in her book, Now I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, she makes a distinction between hate crimes, what white supremacists, Klan members engage in, and the everyday insults, slights, and bias that people of color experience. She would say that, and she uses the language in this way, that people of color experience little murders every single aspect of their day. That is in contrast to the grand execution that everyone sees and condemns, a hate crime, the killing that goes on. And she is saying that well-intentioned, well-meaning individuals will always stand against overt acts of hatred and crime, but they do less damage to the standard of living of people of color than the everyday put-downs and insults that strikes at the core of one's integrity, that creates disparities or inequities in education, employment, and healthcare. She is saying that these are not micro effects, they are macro impacts that are going on, and that this is what is happening. And she tells her story, of the story of people who are most oppressed and silenced in this particular way. What is race talk? Let me share with you a classroom situation or a dialogue, a description when we were, let me go on. The book that came out was based upon a series of 4 studies that we conducted at Teachers College. We identified a group of white students, a group of students of color, a group of white faculty, and a group of faculty of color. And we explored with them what they saw constituted a difficult dialogue on race from their experience in the classroom situation. And what we did was tried a series of intersections to find commonalities and differences. Well, to make a long story short, what we found was something I've mentioned. Almost every one of the difficult dialogues that they gave examples or talked about was triggered by a racial micro aggression, whether it be a micro assault, a micro insult, or a micro invalidation. The 3 forms of microaggressions, almost all difficult dialogues, were triggered from that. The second thing we discovered was that most students and faculty of color could identify the trigger. They could say that it was because such and that was offensive, and on and on. Our white students and white colleagues had great difficulty. They knew something was amiss. They would sense the tension in the classroom, but they could not put their finger on it. So when we begin to talk about the importance of educators and facilitators facilitating difficult racial dialogues, the conclusion is that you can't facilitate a dialogue if you don't know what's happening. And that is one of the primary areas that we encounter in racial dialogues. And let me share with you this particular statement that was brought up by a white male professor. Teaching a class in urban education, I was analyzing brief biographical sketches of Black Americans who described how race impacted their lives and the special hardships they encountered in education. Contrary to the usual class involvement, the responses were brief, tepid, and guarded. It was like pulling teeth to get any type of response. Sound familiar? Silence that occurs when you enter this particular dialogue. Finally, a white female student observed that it was not a race issue, and that being a woman, she had always also experienced low expectations from teachers. Immediately, a white male student chimed in and asked, "Isn't it a social class issue?" Another white female student agreed and went into a long monologue concerning how class issues are always neglected in discussions of social justice. She asked, quote, "Why is everything always about race?" Now, some of you know what's happening. You see this occurring, and I can see by your nonverbal, some of you, your smiles, that you know that this is very typical of what you see occurring in the classroom here. I could sense the energy in the classroom rise when one of the few Black female students angrily confronted the white female student with these words, quote, "You have no idea what it's like to be Black. I don't care if you are poor or not, but you have white skin. Do you know what that means? Don't tell me that being Black isn't different from being white," end quote. A Latina student also added to the rejoinder by saying, quote, "You will never understand. whites don't have to understand. Why are white people so scared to talk about race? Why do you always have to push it aside? These are observations being made by two students of color of where the discussion is flowing. Do you see that? Okay, let's continue. The two white female students seemed baffled and became defensive. After an attempt to clarify their points, both white female students seemed to only inflame the debate, right? You know, this happens. One of the female students began to cry, and the second student indignantly got up, stated she was not going to be insulted, and left the classroom. At that point, many of the students tried to comfort the crying student, while the few students of color appeared unmoved. How inhumane, you know, in terms of, and we'll get to this issue. Let's go on with this dialogue here. As a white male professor, I felt overwhelmed with anxiety and paralyzed. I was fearful about losing control of the classroom dynamics and didn't know what to do. Finally, I told everyone to calm down, not to let their emotions interfere with their learning, and to respect one another. After classmates began consoling the crying student, I suggested that we table the discussion and go on to another topic. Okay, let me just get some input from you. What do you see happening in this typical description? I mean, we receive many similar types of descriptions of what happens when race talk begins to occur in the classroom. Any of you care to, what observations do you have about what's happening here? Yes?
It's apparently too difficult because the professor doesn't know how to facilitate such a conversation. But I think what's even most offensive is that because the white student became uncomfortable and started crying, that to appease that student and that discomfort and tension in the room, they had to close that conversation when it was just beginning. And I feel bad for the students of color in there who just had to be silenced.
Okay,
and
good.
Continue that conversation.
Good, and that really, that is a microaggression in itself. By by sidetracking and not allowing. What other things do you see going on? Yeah.
I see the white students personalizing a systemic issue. So instead of talking about something that's happening at a systemic level in the role we all play in it, you're hearing I'm a racist instead of things are racist, and so it makes it difficult to have a conversation because everything from that point will be personal attack.
Okay. Okay. Other comments or observations? Yeah.
You kind of mentioned that at some point, I think you said like inhumane, like there's this feeling of like when students of color, people of color are unmoved by these things, then they become placed in these kind of conceptions of maybe some sort of stereotype.
Why do you think the two women of color seem unmoved by it?
Right. Well, because either they might occupy some like angry person of color position or whatever it might be, that I think a lot of folks get put into.
Okay, I think you're bringing up something else, that when you raise an issue, you can, they pathologize your response. You're an angry black woman, angry black men, or, you know, in terms of raising this issue. Like one person said, why is everything about race? You know, it's an attempt to dilute or sidetrack the conversation. Was there another person? Okay, other comments here. What do you see happening here? What do you see as a perspective coming? See, this is one thing that we began to do. What are the students of color experiencing? What are the white students experiencing? And what is the white male professor experiencing? Because they are all interacting with each other in a way that leads to unsuccessful racial dialogues. In our studies, we find that unsuccessful racial dialogues, in fact, most race talk is unsuccessful. Truthfully, what we find is that it perpetuates biases and prejudice. it prevents empathic understanding from going on. It creates anger and resentment, and it reinforces the thought that we should avoid one another. It leads to that things. But in those rare instances where we find race talk to be successful, there are a lot of positive issues. There's a dispelling of racial stereotypes and biases. There's increased compassion. There's less fear of differences. There's lower defensiveness. There are many positive aspects if you are able to get through this race talk. And this example is so typical of how we both sabotage and are ineffective in terms of a racial dialogue.
Hello brothers and sisters, welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you are doing great from wherever you're watching this video from. Again, as you know, I'm your host and presenter Agent Stories. And just a minute, I want to talk about an important concept. And the concept is meritocratic lies that they gave black people. Yes, the meritocratic lies that they give black people. So apparently, all these folks expect black people to put in the work. But of course, black folks are putting in the work. But the biggest question is, why are black people not successful as white people while they're putting the work? And then the reality comes out that for a black person to become successful, they have to work as hard as 4 times to be compared with a mediocre white man. And so you understand the reality is not the same between all these two groups of people. And the reality that comes out is that there are systemic issues that these people are putting a blind eye to. And they're saying that racism ended a long time ago and that black people should just work hard just like anybody else. But they are putting a blind eye to all the systemic issues that have been happening. To all the systemic issues that have been happening around the world. And so you get to see and you get to understand how all these people operate. And you ask yourself a question and you say that, damn, there's so many things that they are trying to hide from black people. White folks go to the best of the best schools, get good trainers, get good expertise. But this is not for the same upbringing with black people. I mean, try compare the black community and try compare it with the white community. You can definitely see the truth. You can definitely see what I'm trying to tell you. And this all makes sense to you when now you try to pitch where a black person comes from and a white person comes from. Well, in fact, without forgetting to say that white people had an head start. And that's where meritocracy started. You see, you can put people, somebody that has run so many kilometers and somebody who is just starting, and expect this person that is starting right now to overtake the person that already started like decades ago. It is not possible. I mean, it's close not to being possible. So when you get to understand how all these things operate, it doesn't make sense at all, right? It doesn't make sense. I mean, it doesn't make sense at all. And that's how. And that's the perception that they are giving black people. And so for you as a person who doesn't understand history, I'm not saying that you don't understand history, but I'm saying that to the masses of people that doesn't understand history, it might seem like black people are not putting the effort. Black people are not doing as they're supposed to be doing, right? So as reality is, they get to understand that indeed they messed up. And when the truth is, they get to see the oppression, they get to see the bondage that black people have come through. And it just starts to making sense that indeed black people were saying the truth. Understand that the system had to collapse like this. The American system right now is collapsing, is exposing the meritocratic lies that are told to black people. And now it's extending to white folks. And now they're getting to see the truth. They're getting to understand the truth and how all these things come and operate. That's how they get to understand how all these things operate, brothers and sisters. I just want to know your opinion in regards to this, brothers and sisters. As you know, I don't really have much to say. The professors have explained important concepts that we all need to understand, important concepts that as a social science student you need to equip yourself with. And I think it's important for a person who always studies race relations as to understand the meritocratic lies, because the economic part in the United States and everything that is happening, it's affecting them politically, socially, and geopolitically. And so, brothers and sisters, I just want to know your opinion in regards to this, because I believe it's important for us to get to know, get to understand how all these things operate. Right. So, let me know your opinion in regards to this. Right. As you know, I'm your host and presenter, Genetic Stories. But until then, let me see you in my next video. Peace, love, and harmony. Salute.